There we are. Now it's official. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's By the Book virtual event hosted by the University of Chicago Press in partnership with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore here in Chicago. My name is Adrienne Myers. I'm from the press and I'll be your host tonight. First off, I want to introduce the book series. Thank the Seminary Co-op for co-hosting with us. Always feel free to check them out for upcoming author events and to check out the University of Chicago Press website for author events as well. I'll be posting a link in the chat to purchase Will's new book from the co-op so we can support them as much as we can. And I'll also post a link to the University of Chicago Press YouTube page where you can view the recording of this event in about a week or so. So first of all, then, I want to introduce tonight's speakers. Will West, who's a professor of English, Comparative Literary Studies, and Classics at Northwestern University. He's the author of As If, Essays in As You Like It, and Theaters and Encyclopedias in Early Modern Europe. He also edits the journal Renaissance Drama. And tonight we are celebrating his fabulous new book with the press, Common Understandings and Poetic Confusion. We'll be joined in conversation by Ellen MacKay, who's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. She's the author of Persecution, Plague, and Fire, Fugitive Histories of the Stage in Early Modern England. So I'm going to turn it over to Will and Ellen to chat for a little bit. Once we get closer to the end of the event, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions that come to you throughout the event, feel free to post them in the chat and we'll read them out whenever the time comes. Will, Ellen, over to you.
Thank you.
So much. So it's a great pleasure to be Will's conversation partner for the launch of his spectacular new book. And I encourage all of you to click that link and get your copy from the Seminary Co-op. We had a brief conversation. Thank you, Richard, for the modeling. We had a brief conversation about the way we might begin this conversation, and then we thought we'd keep it pretty fluid. And I know many of you and how acute and insightful your questions are. So I'm going to be sure to reserve a reasonable amount of time for conversation at the end. But I thought we'd start at the very end of the book in the acknowledgement section, where Will offers this crucial anecdote about the instigation to the project itself. Where he says, is it okay, Will, if I just read this out? I mean, I realize I should let you.
Sure, I can just tell the story.
Yeah, you tell the story.
So I mean, any book comes from a lot of places, and there's no single origin story, right? There's sort of multiple. That was the moment when, but one of the moments when this book sort of came together was when I was teaching a class on what was once called pre-Shakespearean drama. And like an idiot, I didn't see how that was going to set things up for a long time. People didn't know how to write plays, and then Shakespeare. But one of the plays, which was not the point, right? But one of the plays I taught was Three Lords and Three Ladies of London, which is a great play, although not particularly like any play by Shakespeare. Which is what my students were really waiting for, right? And after I taught that play, a student came up to me and said, what would it be like to like a play like Three Lords and Three Ladies of London? And that really got me thinking because I assume people did I like Three Lords and Three Ladies of London, but I assume people before me liked Three Lords and Three Ladies of London. And that started me thinking about what is it that we look for when we go to a play? What do we think we're going to see? And recognizing that it seemed to me that early playgoers had a very different sense of why you would do this thing, right? I mean, it's a kind of a very curious, going to see a play is a very curious habit. But I don't think it's a consistent habit. I think it's had multiple motivations. And so that was sort of a moment when I started thinking, what if Elizabethan playgoers really saw something or went to a playhouse for a very different reason than we do?
I love that your response to this question is not the defensive one. You assume.
In fact, it was the defensive one. Why do you ask, right?
Right.
Do you think King Lear is so great?
Right. How are you not beguiled?
Yeah.
by these admonitory allegorical figures. Yeah, I find the phrasing of the question, or your paraphrase of the student's question, really helpful in floating for us this really crucial term in your project, which is what is it to like the theater, and also what is it like to be at the theater? And not totally unaffiliated concepts, but it seems to me your project depends really heavily on affinity by way of understanding or coming at an answer to this question, right? What is it that people are partaking of or thinking that they will be partaking of when they show up at the Playhouse? And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk through maybe either or both of those forms of like. And I'll say I asked for the table of contents to come up in the chat, just because I think the categories that we'll use is to talk about the forms of, let's say, the forms of experience, or maybe sometimes the forms of liking, are really interesting. And I know not everybody has the book in hand, but this is I think a good way for you to get a first taste of it, as it were, or taste of its organizational gambit. Yeah, so talk about like.
So
Can you talk about
let me
like?
say a little. I'm interested in likenesses in this book, and what playgoing and playing were like. But the way I try to get at that is to ask to what they were likened. Partly because I mean, I see Stephen Orgel is here, and I quote him very early in the book saying, plausibility is the least historical category we have, right? And I don't always trust our sense of what things were like when we look at early plays. So what I tried to do in the book was look at the figures that people use for going to plays, the figures of speech. How did they talk about? What were their ways of speaking about going to plays? To what were plays likened, or to what was playgoing likened? And this is then the table of contents that, thank you, Adrian, for putting this up, includes a lot of things to which playgoing or playing or plays were likened, right? They were likened to eating. They were likened to a particular kind of interruptive, premature closure that was called the non-plus, right? That was the sort of the response that brooked no further response, right? And allowed something else to happen. They were like the confusion that was said to characterize the playhouses, right? That the noise, but also the mingling of all the different kinds of people. And so these are sort of some of the things that people liken plays and playgoing and playing to in the period. Although, it's certainly not a comprehensive list at all. I mean, at an early stage of this, I really fantasized about having like a deck of cards or something instead of a book, or a loose leaf binder, where you could have sort of little folders with different things to which playgoing was likened, and you could kind of shuffle them around and not even try to have a chapter structure. And then I lost the courage of my convictions. But in some ways, that would have been a more honest description of the huge number of figures that get used for playing and playgoing in the period.
So, and I think it's therefore like you provide the apt caution as I now move ahead to try to make claims about your meta categories, right? Like having just said that the categorization process itself is maybe not fully commensurable with what it is that you're trying to bring into view. But I think what really strikes me about many, if not all, almost all, I would say, of these terms is how you bring out their firm embeddedness in the flesh, right? They're often non-hermeneutic processes that you're describing. Some of them have a certain automaticity to them or mechanicity to them. And I think even the terms that we associate with a strongly interpretive practice, like understanding, right, are processes that you bring out to be fundamentally or more literally very earthy, very embodied, very enfleshed processes. And I guess I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what it means to sort of take the concept of what is playing like out of the, the heady domain that we as scholars are supposed to reside in, and talk a little bit about, right, what it means to translate these concepts, maybe for an audience that is especially poorly calibrated to understand and register.
So thank you. So another thing about these figures of speech or ways of speaking that I sort of picked out is a lot of them are sort of, for lack of a better word, they're non-theoretical, right? I think they're a kind of a common knowledge, which is where part of the title comes from, right? This sense of a shared discourse that is developing as playing is developing, right? As playing and playgoing are defining themselves as distinct parts of culture, and people are learning the types of things that you say about them, right? And so these terms are sort of in flux. There's a sort of period in the early 1590s, it seems to me, when there's a lot of inventiveness in the way people talk about playing. And then partly because playing assures everybody that it's something very, very new, which historically we know it's not, right? It has all these roots. But one of the things that is distinctive about the playing that we think of as Shakespeare's theater, right, or Shakespeare's drama, is that it is constantly telling us how new and exciting it is, how different it is. So there's this period of great flux in the vocabulary. And then it seems to me that it starts to crystallize, right? As people learn, these are the things that we say about going to plays. But as I said, it's not meant to be a precise. Ben Jonson wants a kind of a precise, critical, judgmental language for going to plays, but a lot of people in the playhouse don't seem to care, right? So all those people who Ben Jonson says don't be like those grounded judgments, don't be like those understanders, or the people who follow Jonson say that, it seems to me that they have a stance towards playing as well, and that stance is partly a physical stance, right? It's not just a kind of an intellectual calibration towards, what do I do when I go to the playhouse? It has everything to do with posture and habitus and gesture and the way you hold yourself towards the stage. The title, I mean, to me, in that table of contents, again, so this is my second origin story, I guess, unless it's my third. Another place this book began is where the title is, right, with the idea of the understanding judgment, or the grounded judgment, what Jonson calls the grounded judgment. This is what Hamlet calls groundlings, but most people call, when they say anything about them at all, understanders, right? And then when you call the people who stand in the yard the understanders, you get to make the joke that they don't really understand anything, right? So part of what I tried to do here was I tried to imagine what does an understander understand that is invisible to somebody who wants a more articulated form of judgment, somebody, a Ben Jonson figure or a Philip Sidney figure, who doesn't want this kind of sloppy everything confusion, who wants something different. But those people, the groundlings, the understanders, are understanding something, right? They're doing something with these plays. And that something is partly expressed in this non-theoretical language they use, and also their physical posture with regard to the play or whatever they're seeing. I mean, this is also where confusion comes in. The other thing that's said about the understanders, right, is that they're always in a state of confusion, and the playhouse is in a state of confusion, partly because it's always loud, we are told, but also partly because it's this sort of receptacle into which all different kinds of people pour and get sort of tossed around and shuffled, right? And again, there's a kind of a fantasy that you can rise above that in the gallery, right? But when people talk about the experiences of playgoing, right, they talk about this confusion that is part of it. And playgoing really is unusual in this period because it celebrates this confusion, right? Usually in early modern terms, confusion is terrible. I'm teaching Milton right now, right? So, which has nothing to do with any of this, except they're in book one. Satan and all fallen angels are lying confounded in confusion on the burning lake, right? Confusion is the worst, except in the playhouse, where it somehow manages to be a way of making something new and exciting.
Yeah, I find that vision really thrilling, and also like marvelously accessible. I mean, I think one of the interventions of the project is to show those of us who are theater historians that some of our complaints about theater historians of the past, right, the attesters of the past, being too meager,
Right.
or too unaccommodating of the, you know, the shifting meanings of, say, a natural sounding actor or a lively performance or an antic clown or whatever, right? That they do in fact offer paradigms, right, ways of speaking that speak to formations, embodied formations and flesh formations that we can conjure with, that we continue to conjure with, and that we've left to secondary. Can I ask you, so I think the chapter on eating offers us a lot
To chew on?
to banter a little bit with, particularly because it, I think, connotes so much, right? The process of eating conveys so much, and I think I wanted to have you talk a little bit about how the particular consumables, comestibles that one finds sold in the vicinity of the playhouse, sold to be consumed in the playhouse, consumed in the playhouse, right? How these start inflecting, not just playing in general, but particular kinds of playing. I'm thinking of your discussion, you know, of gingerbread, for instance, and its affinity with emotions. And I love how you sort of venture in that domain by talking about how, you know, peanuts and Cracker Jacks somehow give us a kind of perceptual orientation to pastime even now, right? It's sort of part of the perceptual ecology, and shapes somehow the texture of that experience, even if we don't cling to it, you know, in the way that scholarship would do. And so, yeah, so I want to invite you to talk about how two activities that seem to be happening synchronously become, you know, fused and perceptually sort of interarticulated.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So let me start with one thing that this gives me an opportunity to say is, so this is not really this I wanted the study to engage with sort of material culture and the archaeology of the playhouses that we find. But one of the things that I try to insist on here is that this is a good example of where our sense of what makes sense may mislead us, right? So in terms of eating, right, we know people ate all kinds of stuff in the playhouses because we find all kinds of stuff in the playhouses in the archaeological record. But the things that people want to talk about when they talk about playing and eating while you go to a playhouse are not turtle meat, right, which is something that people ate, right, at playhouses apparently. But nobody has anything to say about turtle meat. But they're extremely interested in nuts, right, and they're extremely interested in bottle ale, and they're extremely interested in apples, right? Later on, they become interested in oranges. And this is because these are foods that somehow acquire a symbolic resonance with regard to playing, like Cracker Jack with baseball games. You may or may not ever eat Cracker Jack at a baseball game, but you can know that Cracker Jack is a thing. Cracker Jack and hot dogs are things that you eat at a baseball game, even if you would never eat those things yourself or never go to a baseball game. And something like that happens with playing too, right? So in just those examples, nuts are important to playing because you crack them, right? And that is a way of being loud, and depending on who you're cheering for, basically either interrupting the players and being an obnoxious jerk, or interrupting the players and being a cool member of the crowd that is watching the players, right? Bottle ale is the same way. It's loud when you take the top off, and so it sounds like hissing, and so it's got this kind of it's able to insinuate itself into the ecology of the playhouse, right? And apples are interesting because you can throw them, or you can chase them, or you can, find them on the ground, right? So all these foods are things that presumably people really did eat, but at playhouses, but they ate a lot of other things that somehow don't speak of playing, right? You can eat sushi and nachos at a baseball game now, but nobody talks about eating sushi. I mean, I don't think they do. Talk about eating sushi and nachos at a baseball game. Same with playing, right? You don't say, "Oh, I went to the playhouse and I had some turtle meat," right? I had gingerbread. Gingerbread is another great playhouse food because it's very showy. It's very sort of sweet and light. It has no substance, at least when you talk about it, it has no substance. It's often sometimes made of disgusting things that you would rather not know about, right? But so it's a kind of an emblem of the facade of the player, right? Who's wearing these great clothes, but is actually a terrible person, or is portraying something affectively profound, but is themselves emotionally shallow, right? So the foods that get picked out as important in the playhouse are partly picked out to tell us something about the playhouse.
I wonder too, reading that chapter made me think about, onstage calls for onions to create tears, or onstage calls for vinegar to make the devil roar, for instance, and how that those particularly acute or sharp tastes, right, migrate into a kind of pronounced account of what it is to fabricate those emotions or those performance states too, right? It seems like you use this fabulous phrase when you talk about the launched apple. You say it's feedback from the audience. There's a lot of really wonderful wordsmithing in this book that I can strongly recommend. And it seems to me there is this affinity, right? It's the eating, you described some of this, right? The appearance of tragedy carrying the bloody bowl that evokes something like a blood pudding. But there is a reciprocal eating, I think, and maybe cue taking on this level that happens back and forth, right, across the apron.
Yeah, so just thinking about the apple, the thrown apple, I mean, that's something that it seems to me, one way one could look at that, right, is a kind of establishing the distinctness of the players and the crowd, right? The sort of the crowd as agent hurls the apple in disgust at, or whatever emotion you have when you throw an apple, at the players who deserve to have apples thrown at them. But it's also a way of bringing them together, right? This is the kind of communication passing both ways in the playhouse, which is another thing that strikes me as really important. Is it's our sense that the important distinction. I mean, I think this is a modern sense of the important distinction in a theater is sort of at the lip of the stage, right, where their world ends and our world begins. But I think in a playhouse, it's the shared space that contains both the players and the audience that is sort of seen as the defining space. And the really important border is the one that is the ring around the playhouse, or the box around the playhouse. And the thrown apples are a way of bringing those together. I love the comment about these sort of the sharp things that are going to sort of heighten emotional response, which I don't much talk about. I do talk about garlic, and the way garlic is another one of these emblematic foods, partly because it's imagined, garlic and then the smell of beer are imagined to be these kind of literal atmospheres which are bathing everybody together, whether they want to or not, right? That's the way that one of the ways that people talk about the smell of garlic and the smell of beer in the playhouse is that it's this pervasive thing that is uniting bringing everybody together into the shared space, reminding the people in the galleries, that they're down here with the people who smell like garlic, or the people who are cracking open their beer bottles and smelling yeasty, their barmy smell.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of pervasion is so
Yeah.
interestingly pronounced, because it seems to me that that eating is also always smelling, right? It seems
Right.
like those are necessarily not just collocated, but almost inseparable as processes. So, the particular action of a particular spectator has this effect. And I guess with the cracking of the nut, right, there's an olfact, there's an oral
Right.
transmission too, right? So it's not as though these actions are proprietary, even though we might understand them to be super atomized to the individual spectator. They have this effect of somehow being pervasive.
Right. No, they're all shared. I mean, I think that's also one of the things that's important. I mean, gingerbread is sometimes talked about as something that you kind of huddle over your tiny piece of your tragic little sad but beautiful piece of gingerbread, right? But all these other things, when I crack my nuts or throw my apple, everybody around me has, and smell like garlic, everybody around me has to enjoy that with me, right? Whether they want to or not. But I think that's, again, that's that sense of the way the crowd spreads into itself or is mixed, right, and assembles itself out of all these constituent parts. That's also it strikes me as a key part of the experience of playgoing, or at least the way the experience of playgoing is represented for us. Right, people come in with their own tastes, but you leave tasting like everybody.
Yeah, that seems absolutely, that just names exactly a condition that just comes up again and again by both, fans or practitioners of theater and critics. I find also this concept really, or this idiom really helps me think a little bit differently about the snap and bite of satire and the kind of collective engagement in it, and the biting olfactory nature of foods makes that bite, again, pervasive, right? Not just particular to a targeting author, but much more of a...
No, I mean, satire is interesting in this context too, right? Because it is so often figured as a biting mouth, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, the eating mouth is a more generous or a safer version, the mouth that can be fed, as opposed to the mouth that will sort of savage you. And, when we think about the vocabulary of critic, this comes out of the tradition of satire, right? Which is, historically, this is interesting, right? Because so many people both write satires and plays, but they are also held apart in some ways as distinct applications, right? I think, right? And whereas satire is something closer to this ideal of the critical listener, right? Who carefully weighs and has opinions, as opposed to the more sort of absorbative sponge-like understander who just takes in everything, uncritically, somebody would say. But I would say that kind of presence or openness is a different sort of cognitive adaptation to playing.
Yes, it's a kind of gaping state, right? As opposed
to gaping is another.
That seems, exactly. So can I come back? You said, you mentioned this sort of savaging force of satire. And so I think that's a good way to transition to another figure that I think you really do amazing work with, which is the staked bear, the bear that is really the motivating concept in the non-plus chapter. And you discuss how, for those of us who, feel that we have some sense of the entertainment ecology of early modern England, we read bear baiting often from the stance of theatrical interest, and miss a lot of what is specific about bear baiting, and maybe miss how bear baiting has become such or how bear baiting conjures such a specific experience of the player or of performance. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just it's pretty marvelous.
Yeah, so bear baiting is another one of these things where I think playing likes to figure itself as somehow akin to bear baiting, right? But again, this is partly our sense of what happens in bear baiting is, as you say, filtered through what we read about it in playing. And partly this is because bear baiting is not itself a particularly articulate art form, right? We can read about bear baiting, but bear baiting doesn't seem to be particularly interested in representing itself, whereas playing is obsessively interested in representation. But so what I think we can tell, though, is that playing takes a very particular angle on bear baiting that is not the angle that bear baiting seems to have taken on itself, right? In bear baiting, I mean, so for one thing, and again, it's like eating, because it's like the question of eating, because the historical record, the material record, suggests that people are figuring out ways of representing playing and bear baiting by looking at the material record, but putting it into a very particular discourse, right? So bear baiting, it seems like, was really much more about the dogs than the bears. Dogs seem to be the ones who won bear baiting. If you only read plays, you get the sense that bears always died, but of course they didn't. This was a kind of, repeat performance. And that, a lot of people have written about this as well, right? I didn't discover this, but I think what is so interesting about what we can see in bear baiting is how playing takes on this other activity, this other sort of entertainment activity that is like playing in some ways, is not like playing in other ways, but insistently uses it to talk about itself, right? So, I mean, at one point I talk about how in the introduction to Taming of the Shrew, Sly can't be a player, right? Or he clearly knows plays, right? He can quote from the Spanish tragedy, but he can't be a player because then he would instantly see through the whole frame tale of Taming the Shrew. And I think as a kind of substitute for that, he's made a bear ward among his other sort of occupations, right? And this is what it seems to me is playing's way of saying, when we can't represent ourselves as doing what we're doing, we can represent ourselves as somehow being engaged with bear baiting, right? This is an analogous activity. But the thing I find interesting for the point of view about playing is the way it takes this other complex activity and turns it into a way of talking about itself. That is, playing turns bear baiting into a way of talking about playing.
Absolutely. And it invests, bear baiting with, I think, some of the, tragic capacity that's being developed. I mean, I think there's an interesting recognition, even if it's a strong misconstruction of what's going on. It says something, right? That this loathsome project of baiting beasts produces, something like Macbeth's account of being, caught at the stake, right? And so, yeah, it seems to me, you've caught a set of feelings of entrapment and violence that have a really compelling inflection that are hard to derive in another domain, right? You can see, in other words, the need of the importation, even if it's something of a reshaping.
Although one of the things that interests me, right there, I mean, there are other good stories that you could tell with bear baiting.
Sure.
For instance, than this one of the kind of the heroic, embattled, solitary figure beset by wretched little yelping, creatures which will pull it apart, right? That's the typical one. That's the playhouse bear usually, or the bear in a play. But there would be there's another interesting story about bear baiting, which is, the story of the bear ward who sends the bear out. The bear is mauled. The bear ward takes it and nurses it back to health and then sends it out again, right? Which is, historically, we know that's the way you handle bears. And eventually the bear is sort of more and more mutilated and finally is fed to other bears, right? I mean, but like that seems to sort of, or actually cut up and fed to the dogs that were baiting it, years before. I mean, that seems like that is crying out to be allegorized in a different way, but that's not the story that playing wants to tell about bear baiting, right? It wants to tell this story of sort of the heroic lone figure, the indomitable Macbeth facing all these curs, or Gloucester suddenly realizing in Lear that he is the bear that is being baited, or Malvolio in Twelfth Night, who's kind of consistently made into a bear, or repeatedly made into a bear.
So I think I'll ask one more question and then open up the floor for the questions from our guests. And it's a sort of a meta question, but I think I am a strong admirer of the way in which you've managed to orchestrate such a coherent and compelling account of playgoing without letting your arguments be determined by their aptness or their fitness in relation to plays, right? So it seems to me that for those of us who are trying to extract theatrical experience from the testimony of the period, we rely heavily on plays as sort of corroborative documents, and the degree to which we feel like we've hit upon a strong account, I think, depends heavily upon its matching some sense of the affective world or just the embodied world of the plays that we read with it. And so that seems to me a little bit like doing the work of theater history without the net of the dramatic corpus in the foreground, at least. I mean, certainly you have some wonderful play readings, and so I'm eager to hear you talk about that a little bit, right? So what is it like leaving behind that form?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I wanted in this to avoid the temptation of the good reading, the brilliant reading. And I don't, maybe that's because I didn't have a whole lot of brilliant readings in me of sort of, this scene will never be the same again, because, and instead I wanted to see how the plays were sort of speaking about their own experience, or reflecting the experiences that they were imagining were brought to them. And again, I'm not the first person to do this. This makes me want to tell two more origin stories for the book. And one is the one that, probably everybody here knows. We can really count on possibly one hand, but certainly both hands, the eyewitness accounts we have of playing in this time, where we know somebody's not just talking about playing, but they are talking about, I went to this particular performance. We know lots of people who went to plays, but we don't have a lot of people who went to a play and said, this is what I saw, right? And that seems, well, I think the first thing that I think a lot of us think is, oh, what a shame, what a shame that nobody wanted to write down, saw Burbage tonight in Hamlet. I think this is going to be a big hit. He really knocked it out of the park. There's the baseball again, right? As if sort of those accounts had been there, but never appeared. And one of the things that I wonder is if, to me, this absence of that kind of evidence, which seems, I think, to moderns so much what you would go to see a play for, what you would say having seen a play, seems not to have been part of the way earlier playgoers went to see them. And when I say earlier playgoers, I also don't want to suggest that there's sort of, once upon a time, there was this kind of play going, and now there's this kind of play going. I actually suspect that different eras have quite different rules for what you do when you see a play, even though, the behavior of going to a place, watching people put on costumes and do things on stage, right, is repeated again and again and again. But so that absence of evidence was another sort of motive for this book, because it seems to me that there's a different kind of evidence, which is all these descriptions of experiences that playgoing is like, which are pervasive, right? And also form a kind of, in the book, I borrow Wittgenstein's term and call it a way of speaking, a discourse, maybe we could call it, a kind of, starts to fall into patterns as people, it seems to me, as different analogies seem to fit and then get reused and taken up, right, as better or worse than other analogies, right, in a way that's different than kind of sometimes a playwright will come up with a sort of brilliant, luminous, never before heard of way of talking about playgoing. And these seemed quite different to me. So that I think is I'm telling that story partly to respond to what you say about the way in which in this book, it seems to me that some of the accounts I give of playing and playgoing don't immediately yield sort of the good reading of, knowing this, now we can return to Hamlet and see whatever, right? Instead, I'm much more likely to try to find those bits in the plays that I think tell us something about the broader experiences that are drawing on those ways of speaking. The second origin story that I wanted to bring up is I love epigraphs in this book. I love epigraphs, period, and particularly in this book, and they kind of get out of hand. But another place this book ended is in 4 lines from Spanish Tragedy, one by Balthazar. He's talking to Geronimo, and Geronimo has just pitched, have I got a play for you? And not only that, we're going to do it in different languages. And Balthazar kind of scratches his head and says, but this will be a mere confusion, and hardly shall we all be understood. And Geronimo says, it must be so, for the conclusion shall prove the invention, and all was good. And this is another moment where I don't know if I even try to sort of, unlock that scene in particular. But for me, that scene in particular unlocked a lot of the ways of thinking about what is going on in the playhouse, right? And in particular, the way it brings together Balthazar's head scratching. Will anybody understand this, or will this be confusion? And Geronimo kind of, seizing on the excluded middle, yes, both, right? The punchline there will be that the real understanding of that Balthazar will come to is not something that it's intellective at all, right? He is going to sort of physically understand at the end of Geronimo's knife when Geronimo kills him during the play. And then the lure that Geronimo offers of conclusion, right? Which is, again, this way, I think that people who are more articulate in speaking about playgoing often imagine that somehow playing comes to a conclusion, and even our sense that the proper unit of analysis is the play as a whole, right? And then there's a conclusion. Strikes me as falling into this lure of articulation, whereas it seems to me, from the point of view of the understander, who embraces not a kind of an articulate understanding, but a kind of open presence to playing, who embraces confusion as productive rather than destructive, or the absence of order, the matrix out of which order can grow rather than what defies ordering. Mm-hmm. Geronimo sort of holds out this lure of the conclusion to sort of reassure Balthazar, this doesn't sound like the play that you understand as a play, but it will be that kind of articulate play. And then, of course, it isn't. But to me, that scene opens up something about playing more than playing opens up something about that scene. And that's another sort of germ of this book and this project.
On this note of thinking about conclusions, we are getting a little bit close to the hour. A terrible segue, I'm sorry. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Ellen and Will, if y'all have any other final questions for each other, go ahead while we let folks start concocting their own questions for us.
Do you want me to start reading these, or?
Yeah, do you want me to read them, Will, or do you want to read them?
I will go ahead and read. I'm just going to go take them in order. Uh, Gina asked about turtle meat, which Richard handily answered. And now Richard has a question of his own, having dispatched of the turtle. Will, in your survey of the evidence of playgoing, what would you say is the distribution of people talking about the play, but not the playhouse, Simon Foreman, however confusedly, and people talking about the playhouse, but not the play, accounts of audience distraction, disturbances, fights, etc. And how many are in the middle ground, actually describing a catalytic reaction or exchange between stage and crowd? Wow, I would say exactly 1/3 each. No, Richard is somebody who I've learned a tremendous amount from. It seems to me that far more people talk about the second two, and I'm not even sure I can distinguish the second two categories that you lay out, than talk about the play. It seems to me, and I have no checklist to confirm this, but it seems to me we get much more sort of comments on what is the crowd doing, what's happening over there, what are you eating, rather than what is being represented on stage. And even I almost wonder if we hear more about craft on stage, the craft of the player, rather than the plot of the play. I'm pretty strongly anti-plot in this book. I have nothing to say about the turtle. And then let's see, Piers Brown has a question about the discussion of eating, and particularly the smelling of the foods the audience was eating. To what extent is this in part a commentary on questions of indigestion? Yeah, exactly. The previously eaten foods belched back, the scraps and sips of foodstuffs distracting and overly strong before they're concocted in the stomach. I think digestion is another one of these figures that I might pass it by glancingly, but of course, digesting something is also when you read and you chop it up into appropriate bits, like for a commonplace book. And it seems to me that that's the kind of the physical digestion, which people often, right? That's often figured as a kind of a miraculous feat, right? The bee goes to, that's not exactly digestion, but the bee visits all kinds of different plants and comes up with honey. But we don't know how it does that. And we take in all this stuff and we somehow produce our bodies out of these things. So I think that's a kind of, the idea that digestion is a kind of a rational process is, I think, something that's more on the side of the critical judgment, whereas this sort of, omnivorous quality of the audience is something that's more associated with the understanders who take in everything, including, as you say, that, yesterday's bits, I'm just going to keep going down. Richard Stride, this is wonderful to have questions from people who actually I've probably, certainly learned from and possibly even ripped off. About the structure of the project, why set the atmosphere against the diegesis? Another way of asking the question, why not see a contrast with bear baiting rather than an analogy? The point about bear baiting and becoming heroic points to poetry, a crucial element in the theater. Yes, Elizabethans loved language and hearing fancy language and sermons, etc. Why not try to integrate that? Yeah, no, absolutely. Fair enough. When I say an analogy, and this gives me a chance to talk about what it means to be like. To be like something is also to be different from it, right? It's to not be the same, but to be like. So an analogy with bear baiting is also a distinction from bear baiting. And I think one of the things I think this book tries to talk about is the ways in which playing establishes itself as something different from anything else. And often it overstates, right? When it sort of presents itself as something very, very new. And we can think about, Tamburlaine or these early plays saying, I'm not going to do that stuff. Or the way plays are constantly kind of looking over their shoulder and saying, this is not your granddad's playhouse. We're going to do something really different. Playing has to establish itself as distinct, a distinct kind of play. right? There's many kinds of play. So these analogies are also contrasts, and the contrasts are also analogies. The language, I think, is another great example. So sermon going is another thing that plays work very hard to say this is like going to a sermon, but it's not going to a sermon, right? And one of the things that opponents of play going often say is playgoers think they get as much from a play as they get from a sermon. That's craziness. And playgoers or players or plays try to work with that similarity. It is like going to a sermon in some ways. In some ways, it's not like going to a sermon. So I don't think that answers your question, but I think that gave me I burgled that to use a chance to talk about analogy, right? But your point is exactly right. I don't want to set up an either or. I don't want to set up a distinction. That strikes me as something that the critical playgoers do, right? This is like the joke about there's two kinds of people in the world, the ones who divide all the people in the world into two kinds of people and the ones who don't. And I think the understanders are the ones who don't, right? They're the ones who sort of take it all in. And then there are other people who watch play and say, this is not enough like a sermon, or we need a better moral here, or, this is too much like a bear baiting. I'm going to keep on paging through. This feels very monovocal. Maybe I should ask you guys to read your own questions. I feel like I'm monologuing here. Jeff, Dolvin, would you read out your question?
Yeah, very, very happy to. Well, as I say, it's the kind of like exactly what I'm reading now.
Yeah. Oh, look.
Yeah. But I just wondered how much of a term that might be for you, given the kind of sort of combinations or confusions of senses that you were talking about. And I just thought about Bottom's dream.
Yeah.
Are there other occasions where that might sort of figure as a trope for the condition you're interested in?
Yeah. So, I mean, in an earlier fantasy version of the table of contents, I was going to try to talk about synesthesia and synesthesic effects in the playhouse, and it didn't end up in there. But in a way, that the idea that synesthesia is the perception of one thing as another, right, or one thing in the mode of another thing, maybe is another way of putting it, is, I think, sort of the only thing that this book is talking about in a way, right? That one of the things that playing tries to do is establish itself as something unique by saying, by something distinctive, let me not say unique, or even better, something specific, rather than sort of offering definitions of itself by analogizing itself to other things that you already know about, presumably, right? And then in turn, offering itself as an analogy for other things, which we see all the time in early modern culture, all the world's a stage type of things, where we're supposed to understand what playing is like, so then we can understand something else that is harder to understand. Holger, do you want to? Is that sort of an answer? It's sort of an answer. Holger.
Oh God! Well, I can. I leave. Can you hear me? I'm leaving my camera off to avoid showing my unwashed self to the world.
I could read this. I just sort of felt like, maybe.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's worse because it's not. It's really not a question. And I hope you can hear me over the dog. I was just baffled. I mean, when you were talking about ways of speaking about the theater, it made me realize that, and I wonder if you talk about this in the book, that like virtually all the comments we have about specific named actors are made by playwrights or by poets. They're not made by people who are outside the system. Right. And that kind of, I mean, frankly, that blew my mind a little just now, because it seems to really require a qualification of how we think about the importance of specific actors as opposed to actorly collectives, say, to the theater experience. I wonder why that is. Like, does it have something to do with the fact that there isn't really an analogy for what actors do in other, like, actors are hard to analogize, right? But I don't know. That turns it maybe into a question.
No, I think that's. I mean, that's another sort of another fantasy another fantasy table of contents had a whole section on naming, which then I just couldn't wrangle into position. And I was thinking about the identities of actors, specific actors, but the ways in which the name of an actor comes to stand for a whole type of acting. So Tarleton's the best part of Tarleton's career comes after he's dead, right? I mean, he's never so successful as when he's left the stage because he's no longer alive. And he has this kind of tremendous presence, seems to have this tremendous presence as a kind of a figure doing all kinds of stuff after he's no longer doing anything. But similarly, right, we along with particular actors who get named by sort of the insiders, characters have a status that's not kind of wholly distinct, right? As you know, right? Tamburlaine is a way to be on stage, and sometimes a way to be off stage, regardless of who's doing that, right? Regardless of whether it's Alan, whether we're thinking of Alan in particular, or just a kind of a Tamburlaine thing that you can do. And then also the constant playing in the moral plays, this bit that so many moral plays do, where somebody will come on and their name will be something like No Good Neighborhood, and they'll know as soon as they introduce themselves, nobody's going to want to hang out with me. I'm No Good Neighborhood. I'll change my name to Good Neighborhood, and that will fool them all, right? And this kind of the ways in which a tremendous amount of effort is spent in playing, trying to sort of figure out the difference between what we might call a proper name and a specific name or a category name for types of behavior, or that is not really an answer. That's more of an encouragement to say, yeah, I think it's an incredibly interesting question. What do people think they're looking at? How do they talk about those things? How important is it to be Ned Allen as opposed to just a stalking Tamburlaine?
I think we'll I think one more question from Eric in the chat, and then we'll officially close things out. But once we close things out, feel free to hang out and chat for a few minutes if we want. Will, do you want to have Eric read this final question out?
So, because people may start splitting because it's 4:30 on a Friday in Chicago and it's even later in other places, I just want to say I am so touched and pleased to see so many people here people who are my friends and my colleagues, but people who I've learned so much from. Some very specific things, some just sort of generally absorbing your modes of thought. And I am so happy to see you here and to get to share my thoughts about this book, which is drawn so much from so many things that people in this Zoom room have taught me. Yay, yes.
Yay. We'll do official applause in a minute. If you want to do this final question, then I'll narrow.
Yeah, so I mean that was meant to be my valediction. So if you have to split.
Oh, beautiful. Well, then we can clap now and then do the question.
But I will. Let's take Eric's question and people. I hope I see you all in Jacksonville. Eric, do you want to read your question?
Sure. Anyway, thanks so much, Will, and so eager to read this book, as I know we all are, from cover to cover. And it's time for dessert. I'm gathering, and I have a bit of sweet in this, but I want to start by asking if you do address in the taste-smell paradigm, thanks so much for that emphasis, contentious substances, and especially, of course, I'm thinking of tobacco, which was metaphysical, for some, and James writes his counterblast. So do you talk about that and the smell and the clouds of tobacco? In my own experience, I fondly recall Stern Grove in San Francisco, where you could have a cloud of cannabis around you, not tobacco. But I mean, do you address that and different responses to, obviously we all know the malcontent and the smoking on stage, all that, and then other contrasts of flavor, the sweet and bitter paradigm in the Fool and Lear, of course, and the sweet performer, the bitter one. And finally, in my question, you've got me thinking even more about Rasa and Bava and that model in the classical Indian theater. of savoring a play. And then at last I cite, of course, Brecht's critique of culinary theater and overly mimetic. And I'm wondering about mimesis and all this too. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, so I don't talk a lot about mimesis in this, partly because I am in this book, I'm less interested, Frank, in the representational aspects of playing than in the ways in which it presents itself physically. I do talk a little bit about tobacco as a kind of, again, as a kind of an atmosphere. And of course, tobacco, whereas I think for us, because we habitually talk about smoking tobacco, whereas we drink a beer and eat an apple, but we smoke a pipe or whatever. But that vocabulary is also developing, right, in the Elizabethan period. You often drink tobacco. People are said to drink tobacco, but I think in playhouses it functions much like garlic. That sense that, you know, this is a corporeal, physical reminder of the way in which we are sharing our space, right? That the guy who is smoking next to me, I get to enjoy his pipe just as much as he does, or not, right? Because that is the nature of our communal existence. And you know, I feel like Brecht is a kind of secret subtext in a lot of this book. This is not Brecht, but it's German, so I'll cite this as yet another origin story for this book.
But I agree with the Brechtian, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Hannah Arendt, in her introduction to Benjamin's Illuminations, reports that Benjamin had always wanted to write a book composed entirely of quotations, and in some ways, that could I have done it? That's what this would have been sort of a collection of things people say about playing that help us see how differently they saw playing, how differently they understood playing than we might understand playing and playgoing.
I think that sounds like a great note to officially close out the event. Thank you so much, Will and Ellen, and everyone for attending, for your wonderful questions. Let's give them a round of applause. We'll stop the recording.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Adrian. Thank you, Ellen.
Yay.
Thank all of you.
Thanks, Ellen.